Matthew had always been afraid of the dark. Even before the masked maniac came to their small town, shadows and the creaks of the old house he lived in would send shivers down his spine. But now it was different. His fear had grown into something far worse, paralyzing terror. The man in the mask was real. He wasn't some story made up by bored kids, or a boogeyman whispered about at sleepovers. He was here, prowling the streets of Winbrook. The first victim had been found 2 months ago. A teenager not much older than Matthew, his body discovered in the alley behind the grocery store. No one talked about the details, but whispers spread like wildfire through the town. There had been others since then. More bodies, more whispers. The killer wore a mask, that much was certain. What kind of mask was debated endlessly, each version more horrifying than the last. Some said it was an animal face, twisted and gory, others claimed it was featureless, just a blank expression that stared unblinking into the night. The adults told everyone to stay inside after dark, but Matthew knew better. He knew the maniac didn't just strike at random. There was a pattern. He had been studying it for weeks, poring over every scrap of information, every rumor he could find. He charted the locations of the attacks, marking them on a map of the town in his room, his hands trembling as the pins formed a trail, an ominous, spreading stain across the streets he'd once roamed freely. Matthew wasn't like the other kids at school. They still played outside after dark, sneaking into backyards, daring each other to see how close they could get to the last crime scene. Not him. He wasn't reckless, and he wasn't about to take any chances. He had memorized every dark corner, every alleyway, every shadowed street the maniac might have prowled. He made mental notes of where to go and where not to go. He wasn't sure when his fear had turned into obsession. But the face of that mask haunted him at night. He could almost see it every time he closed his eyes. He imagined it watching him from the corner of his room, standing still at the foot of his bed, just waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He had to be smarter. Careful. Always careful. But tonight something felt wrong. It was late, far later than Matthew had planned to stay out. His mom had asked him to run to the store for some bread, insisting it would only take a minute. He didn't have the heart to say no, but now here he was, the sun long set, and the streets bathed in the eerie glow of flickering streetlights. The air was thick with fog, curling around the corners of buildings and swallowing the narrow roads in front of him. The town felt abandoned, like everyone else knew something he didn't. His heart raced as he hugged his jacket tighter around himself, the cool autumn wind biting at his skin. He walked fast, his eyes darting to every alley he passed, every driveway, every shadow. He knew exactly where the maniac had been sighted last, and he had plotted a safe route home, avoiding the hot spots. But his gut twisted with unease. What if the killer had moved? What if he was wrong? Footsteps echoed faintly from behind him. Matthew froze, his breath catching in his throat. He stood there, unmoving, the blood rushing in his ears as he strained to listen. The footsteps stopped. Slowly he turned his head, his eyes scanning the fog-covered street behind him. Nothing. His heart pounded as he started walking again, faster this time, his feet barely making a sound on the pavement. He cursed under his breath, his mind racing. Why had he stayed out so late? Why hadn't he listened to his instincts and stayed home like usual? The fog thickened, and the streetlights seemed to dim, casting long, distorted shadows that stretched across the road. Matthew could barely see 10 feet ahead of him now, and his legs ached from the tension. He just had to get home. The grocery store was only a few blocks away. He could make it if he stayed calm. Snap. The sound of a twig breaking behind him made him freeze again. This time he didn't turn around. His entire body tensed, every muscle tight with fear. The footsteps had returned. Slow, deliberate. Closer now. The fog seemed to close in around him, suffocating. He could hear his own breathing, ragged and uneven, as if someone was standing right behind him, matching his every move. He wanted to run, to bolt down the street and never stop, but his legs felt like lead. He forced himself to move, one shaky step at a time. The footsteps behind him quickened. Panic surged through him, every inch of his body screaming at him to move faster, faster. Matthew broke into a sprint. His feet pounded against the pavement, the cold air burning in his lungs as he tore down the street. He didn't care about being quiet anymore. He didn't care about the safe route he'd memorized. All that mattered was getting away. But the footsteps, they were still there. Close. Too close. He could hear them now, clear as day. The soft, steady thud of boots on wet pavement, keeping pace with him, never faltering, never slowing. Matthew's mind raced. He couldn't shake the feeling that the killer wasn't running at full speed. No, he was toying with him, just keeping enough distance to let Matthew think he had a chance. His house was just a block away. He could see the outline of the porch through the haze of fog. He pushed himself harder, his legs burning, his vision narrowing. If he could just make it to the front door, slam it shut, lock it, he'd be safe. He could. A figure stepped out from the fog ahead. Matthew skidded to a halt, his breath catching in his throat as the world seemed to lurch around him. The figure was tall, too tall, and wore a long dark coat that billowed slightly in the wind. But it was the mask that sent icy terror coursing through his veins. It wasn't human, no. It was something out of a nightmare. Pale, featureless, except for a wide, grinning mouth carved into the surface, lips too thin and stretched too far. The eye holes were black pits, empty and endless, staring right at him. It was him. The maniac. Matthew's legs buckled beneath him as he stumbled back, the cold pavement biting into his hands as he fell. The masked figure didn't move, didn't even flinch. It just stood there watching him. Run, a voice whispered in the back of Matthew's mind, but he couldn't move. His entire body was frozen, locked in place by the sheer terror coursing through him. The figure tilted its head slightly as if amused. And then, it took a step forward. Matthew's breath hitched in his throat. He scrambled to his feet, but his legs wouldn't obey. The figure stepped closer, its footsteps slow, deliberate, echoing in the silent street. Each step brought it closer, the grin on the mask growing larger, more sinister, as if feeding off his fear. He had to move. He had to do something. But before he could react, the figure vanished into the fog, swallowed by the mist as if it had never been there at all. Matthew stood there, trembling, gasping for breath, his body still paralyzed with fear. He didn't know if it was gone, or if it was hiding just out of sight, waiting for him to let his guard down. The footsteps behind him returned. This time they were closer. Matthew's mind screamed for him to run. The pounding footsteps behind him were relentless, echoing through the fog like a nightmare that had come to life. His legs finally obeyed, breaking free from the paralysis of fear, and he sprinted down the street toward his house, every muscle burning with desperation. He didn't dare look back, he couldn't. The image of the masked figure standing motionless, that grotesque grin burned into his memory, was enough to keep his legs moving faster than they ever had. The fog seemed thicker now, the streetlights dimmer, the world closing in around him as he ran. His house was only a block away, the pale shape of the front porch barely visible through the murk. His breath came in short, ragged bursts, the cold air stabbing at his lungs. Every step felt like an eternity, and every shadow seemed to shift with malevolent intent. He could still hear the footsteps behind him, slow but steady, as if the maniac wasn't in a hurry. As if he knew Matthew had nowhere to go. Finally, the porch came into view, and Matthew practically threw himself up the steps, his fingers fumbling for the keys in his pocket. His hands trembled so violently that he nearly dropped them, and his vision blurred with panic as he struggled to unlock the door. He could feel the figure closing in, feel that terrible, suffocating presence just beyond the edge of the fog. With a click, the door finally opened. Matthew stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind him and twisting the deadbolt with shaking hands. He backed away from the door, his chest heaving, his heart pounding in his ears. For a moment he stood there, staring at the door, waiting for the sound of footsteps outside. Waiting for the knob to turn, for the door to creak open. But there was nothing. Just silence. Matthew's hands were still trembling, his legs weak from the sprint. He staggered back into the hallway, his head swimming with a mix of relief and terror. He was inside, he was safe. But then he noticed something. The house was too quiet. Matthew's heart sank as he stepped deeper into the hall, his shoes barely making a sound on the old wooden floorboards. Something was off. The shadows in the house felt different, heavier. The air was thick, oppressive, like the entire house was holding its breath, waiting for something. And then his eyes landed on the kitchen door. It was wide open. He knew he had closed it before he left. He always closed it. His mother was meticulous about locking up before they went to bed. But now the door stood ajar, a faint breeze wafting through the house. Matthew's blood ran cold. Had the maniac been here? While he was out, had he come inside? Every nerve in Matthew's body screamed for him to leave, to get out of the house, to run into the streets and find help. But there was nowhere to go. No one else lived close by, and with the fog thickening, he didn't know if he could make it anywhere in time. The man in the mask could be waiting outside, or worse, he could already be inside. Matthew's breath hitched as he backed away from the kitchen, his pulse thundering in his ears. He needed to hide. He needed to get somewhere safe until the maniac, if he was here, left. The bathroom. The door was just a few feet down the hall. He sprinted toward it, his bare feet slipping slightly on the floor as he reached for the knob, his hands slick with sweat. He pulled the door open and slipped inside, locking it with trembling fingers. He sank to the cold tile floor, his back pressed against the wall, and stared at the crack beneath the door, waiting for any sign of movement outside. The seconds ticked by in agonizing silence. Matthew forced himself to breathe, but every inhale felt like it might betray his presence. His mind raced, every creak of the old house sending his heart into overdrive. Was he alone? Had the man in the mask already left? Or was he here, somewhere in the house, lurking in the shadows just beyond the door? And then he heard it. The front door creaked open. Matthew's stomach dropped as the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps echoed through the hallway. His breath caught in his throat as he pressed himself harder against the wall, his body trembling with fear. The footsteps were heavy, boots just like he'd heard before. The maniac had come inside. He was in the house. The sound of the boots grew louder, each step sending a fresh wave of terror through Matthew's veins. They moved methodically as if the maniac was searching the house, checking each room, each corner. He was taking his time, and that somehow made it worse. Matthew squeezed his eyes shut, clamping his hands over his mouth to stifle his breathing. He could hear the maniac moving closer. Every footstep felt like a countdown, drawing him nearer and nearer to where Matthew was hiding. Thud. The footsteps stopped right outside the bathroom door. Matthew's pulse spiked, his entire body frozen in terror. He could see the shadow beneath the door now, long, stretched out, unmoving. He held his breath, every muscle in his body screaming at him to stay still, to not make a sound. For what felt like an eternity, the maniac didn't move. He just stood there, silent, waiting. And then the doorknob turned. The sound was soft at first, almost delicate, as the knob rattled slightly against the lock. Matthew bit down on his lips so hard he tasted blood. He pressed his back against the wall, willing the door to hold. "Please don't open, please don't open." The rattling stopped. Matthew exhaled shakily, the tension in his body so tight it felt like his muscles might snap. But then came the sound that broke him. The click of the lock turning. The door creaked open slowly, inch by agonizing inch, revealing the dimly lit hallway outside. Matthew couldn't move. His entire body was frozen in place, his eyes locked on the widening crack of the door. A boot stepped through the opening. Then another. The figure loomed in the doorway, tall, massive, the mask still grinning in that grotesque, twisted way. The empty black eyes stared down at Matthew, and for a split second their gazes met. The last thing Matthew saw was the mask, its grin impossibly wide, impossibly cruel, before everything went dark. The next day the town was buzzing with disbelief and confusion. The maniac had turned himself in. No one could understand why. He simply walked into the police station at dawn, wearing the same mask, the same boots, and covered in dirt. He didn't resist. He didn't speak. He just stood there as if waiting to be caught. The officers had been too stunned to act at first, but when they realized who he was, the masked man was taken into custody immediately. But there was something else. Something that chilled the town to its core. Matthew was missing. The police searched his house later that morning. The bathroom door was wide open, the lock broken. His flashlight was found on the floor, the batteries long dead. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no broken windows. Just an empty house, and Matthew was nowhere to be found. When they interrogated the maniac, asking why Matthew had been his last target, the man simply smiled behind the mask and muttered a single word before falling silent again. Final. No one could make sense of it.